He found a lion and lioness on the brink of death. Their plea for help changed everything. The Kenyan sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of Mara Ridge National Reserve, where Dr. James Okonkwo had worked as a wildlife veterinarian for nearly 15 years. The drought had entered its 8th month, turning the once lush savanna into a dusty wasteland. Water holes had dried up, prey animals had migrated or died, and the predators were becoming desperate. James's radio crackled to life as he drove his Land Rover across the parched landscape. "Dr. Okonkwo, we have an emergency. 2 lions spotted near the western boundary. They're not moving. Rangers think they might be dead or dying. I'm 20 minutes out," James responded, his stomach tightening. "How close to the boundary?" "Too close. Right near the Kimathi farmlands." James pressed harder on the accelerator. The Kimathi farms bordered the reserve, and tensions between wildlife and farmers had been escalating. Some farmers had begun using illegal pesticides to protect their livestock, poisoning any predator that came near. It was a practice that sickened James. He understood their desperation, but the cost to the ecosystem was catastrophic. When he arrived at the coordinates, 3 rangers were already there, keeping a safe distance. James grabbed his medical kit and tranquilizer rifle, approaching cautiously. What he saw stopped him cold. 2 lions lay in the shade of a withered acacia tree. The male was massive, his dark mane matted with dust and what looked like vomit. But it was his behavior that froze James in his tracks. The lion was using his huge paw to push the female, clearly his mate, toward the humans. Push, pause, push again. The lioness was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and labored. The male lion looked directly at James. In 15 years of working with big cats, James had never seen such an expression on a wild animal. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't fear. It was something that looked disturbingly like desperate hope. "He's asking for help," James whispered to the rangers. "Dear God, he knows she's dying and he's asking us to help her. Doctor, Okonkwo, protocol says we tranquilize first," one ranger warned. James was already moving forward, slowly, his hands visible, his medical kit open. No time. She's going into respiratory failure. Another 10 minutes and she's gone. The male lion watched him approach. Every muscle in James's body screamed at him to stop, to follow protocol, to not walk toward an apex predator with nothing but a medical bag. But something in that lion's eyes held him. When James knelt beside the lioness, the male didn't attack. He stepped back, just 1 step, and watched. James worked quickly, his hands steady despite his racing heart. He recognized the signs immediately: pesticide poisoning. Her pupils were constricted, her muscles were twitching, foam at her mouth. He administered atropine and pralidoxim, started an IV line, gave her fluids and activated charcoal. The male lion lay down 3 feet away, his golden eyes never leaving James's face. "It's okay, big guy," James found himself saying. "I'm trying to help her. Just let me work." After 20 minutes of intensive treatment, the lioness's breathing began to stabilize. Her eyes flickered open briefly, unfocused but alive. The male lion made a sound, not a roar, but something softer, almost like a rumble of relief. James turned his attention to the male, who was clearly poisoned too, just not as severely. The lion allowed James to approach, to examine him, to administer treatment. When James placed a hand on the massive mane to check the lion's temperature, the male lowered his head, pressing it briefly against James's chest. The rangers watching from a distance would later swear they saw the lion bow to the veterinarian. "We need to transport them to Simba Hope," James called out. "Call the center. Tell them we're bringing in 2 critical cases, and call the police. I want whoever did this arrested." The Simba Hope Conservation Center was 20 miles away, state-of-the-art facility that James had helped establish 5 years ago. Getting 2 adult lions there would normally require tranquilization and a specialized transport team. But when the truck arrived, something extraordinary happened. The male lion stood when James walked toward the transport crate. When James opened the door and gestured, the lion walked to his mate, gently gripped her scruff in his jaws, and dragged her toward the crate. Once she was inside, he climbed in after her and lay down beside her, as if he understood this was their only chance. The drive to Simba Hope was tense. James sat in the back of the truck, watching the lions through the crate's bars. The male never took his eyes off his mate, occasionally nuzzling her face, making low sounds that James recognized as lion communication. This wasn't just a breeding pair, this was a bonded couple, and the male's devotion was absolute. At the center, Dr. Sarah Kimani, James's colleague, met them at the intake bay. "James, what happened? And why aren't they sedated?" "Long story," he said. "We need critical care for both, but the female is worse. And Sarah, she's pregnant. I felt the cubs when I was treating her." Sarah's eyes widened. Kenya's lion population had been decimated by habitat loss, human-wildlife conflict, and poaching. Every cub was precious. They worked through the night, administering treatments, running blood tests, monitoring vital signs. The male lion, whom James had mentally named Kazi, the Swahili word for warrior, refused to leave his mate's side even when heavily sedated. When he woke, he would immediately check on her, touching his nose to hers, lying as close as the medical equipment would allow. By dawn, both lions were stable. The female, Amani, James decided, meaning peace, was still weak, but her vitals were improving, and the pregnancy appeared intact. 4 cubs, by the ultrasound's estimate, all with strong heartbeats. They were poisoned by pesticides from the Kimathi farms, James told Sarah. Rangers found evidence of contaminated meat left out deliberately. This pair was part of the Mara Ridge Pride. 6 months ago, there were 12 lions in that pride. Now there are 2. The rest were killed by poachers or poisoned. "So these cubs she's carrying," Sarah said slowly, "they're the last of their bloodline." "Yes." James looked through the observation window at Kazi, who lay with his massive head resting on Amani's flank. "If we can save this family, if we can get those cubs born healthy and eventually release them back into the wild, it would be a miracle." "You don't believe in miracles," Sarah said. "You're a man of science." James thought about Kazi pushing his dying mate toward humans, trusting ancient enemies to save her life. He thought about the way the lion had bowed his head, establishing a connection that shouldn't exist between man and apex predator. "I didn't," he admitted, "but I'm starting to." Over the following weeks, Kazi and Amani slowly recovered. The poison had done significant damage, but both lions were fighters. Kazi regained his strength first, and he used it to watch over Amani constantly. The staff at Simba Hope had never seen such devoted behavior. When Amani ate, Kazi waited until she finished before touching his own food. When she slept, he positioned himself between her and the door, a living shield. James visited them twice daily, and each time Kazi would approach the barrier and lower his head in that same gesture of recognition. It was as if the lion remembered who had saved them, and some unspoken bond had formed in that desperate moment under the acacia tree. "The police made arrests," Sarah told James one morning as they watched the lions. 3 Kimathi farmhands and the farm owner. "They've been poisoning predators for months. The evidence is overwhelming." "Good," James said grimly, "but the damage is done. That entire pride is gone except for these 2. He paused. "How's Amani's pregnancy progressing?" "Remarkably well, considering. The cubs are developing normally. I estimate she has about 6 weeks left." Those 6 weeks were tense. Every day, James worried that the stress and the poisoning would cause complications. But Amani defied every concern. She grew rounder, moved more carefully, and Kazi became even more protective if that was possible. The birth happened on a quiet Tuesday morning. Sarah called James at 4 a.m. "She's in labor. You need to get here." James broke every speed limit getting to the center. By the time he arrived, Amani had delivered 2 cubs and was working on the 3rd. Kazi paced outside the birthing den, making low, anxious sounds. When he saw James, the lion actually came to the barrier, as if seeking reassurance. "She's doing great, big guy," James said softly. "Your mate is strong. Your cubs are strong." By noon, 4 healthy cubs lay nursing against Amani's belly, 2 males and 2 females, tiny and perfect. Their eyes still closed, their future uncertain but possible. Amani looked exhausted but content, licking each cub methodically. Kazi was finally allowed back into the den, and his reaction made several staff members cry. The massive lion approached his cubs with extreme gentleness, sniffing each one carefully, then lying down to create a protective barrier around his entire family. "We did it," Sarah whispered to James. "Against all odds, we did it." "They did it," James corrected. "We just gave them a chance." The story of Kazi and Amani spread quickly. A wildlife photographer who volunteered at Simba Hope had documented their recovery, and the images were stunning. The massive male lion bowing his head to the veterinarian, the tender family moments, the 4 cubs that represented hope for Kenya's struggling lion population. International news outlets picked up the story. Conservation organizations shared it. A documentary team approached James about filming the family's eventual release back into the wild. Donations poured into Simba Hope, and more importantly, the Kenyan government announced stricter penalties for wildlife poisoning and increased funding for human-wildlife conflict resolution. The cubs, named Zawadi, Gift, Tumaini, Hope, Furaha, Joy, and Amani Jr., grew quickly under their parents' watchful care. At 3 months, they were playing, pouncing on their father's tail, learning to be lions. Kazi was a patient teacher, and Amani was a fierce protector. At 6 months, James began the careful process of preparing the family for release, not back to Mara Ridge, where the threat still existed, but to a newly established protected zone called the Zawadi Integral Protection Zone, named after their firstborn cub. It was 200 square miles of pristine habitat, heavily patrolled, with strict anti-poaching measures and no farming allowed within the boundaries. The release day was emotional. James stood with Sarah and a small team of rangers as the transport crates were opened. Kazi emerged first, testing the air, scanning for threats. Then Amani, then the 4 half-grown cubs, tumbling over each other in excitement at the space and freedom. Before disappearing into the tall grass, Kazi turned back one final time. He looked directly at James, held his gaze for a long moment, then lowered his head in that now familiar gesture. Then he turned and led his family into their new home. "He was saying goodbye," Sarah said, wiping her eyes, "and thank you." "I know," James replied, his own voice thick. Over the following year, tracking collars showed that the family was thriving. Kazi and Amani successfully taught their cubs to hunt. The cubs reached maturity. And then, in their 2nd year of freedom, Amani gave birth again, 3 more cubs naturally, in the wild without human intervention. The documentary, titled "The Lion Who Asked for Help," won awards and was viewed by millions worldwide. It sparked conversations about human-wildlife coexistence, about the intelligence and emotional capacity of animals, about the responsibility humans have to the natural world. James received job offers from around the world, speaking invitations, research grants. He turned them all down. His place was here at Simba Hope, giving other animals the same chance he'd given Kazi and Amani. 2 years after the rescue, James drove out to the Zawadi zone with Sarah. They parked on a ridge overlooking a waterhole. Through binoculars, they could see the pride, Kazi, still magnificent with his dark mane. Amani, now teaching her 2nd set of cubs, the original 4 cubs, now adults themselves. One of the females pregnant with the next generation. 12 lions, Sarah said softly. From 2 poisoned animals barely clinging to life to 12 lions. That's what compassion looks like. James lowered his binoculars, remembering that moment under the acacia tree when a desperate lion had pushed his dying mate toward humans, trusting ancient enemies because he had no other choice. Remembering the weight of that massive head against his chest, the unspoken understanding that had passed between species. "You know what the most important thing I learned was," James said. "It wasn't about veterinary medicine or conservation tactics. It was that trust can exist anywhere, even between predator and prey, even between man and beast, if someone is brave enough to extend it first. Kazi trusted me with the most precious thing in his world. How could I do anything less than everything in my power to honor that trust?" As the sun set over the Zawadi zone, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the pride of lions moved toward the waterhole. Kazi paused at the ridge, his silhouette powerful against the sunset. For just a moment, he looked toward where James and Sarah sat in their vehicle, too far away to see them clearly, but perhaps remembering. Then he threw back his head and roared, a sound of triumph, of territory, of survival against all odds. His family joined him, their voices carrying across the savannah, and James felt tears running down his face. They had saved each other, really. Kazi and Amani had saved themselves and their bloodline through sheer will and devotion, and they had saved James's faith in what conservation could be. Not just science and protocols, but connection and compassion, and the miraculous bridges that could form when different species chose trust over fear. In the end, that desperate plea for help under an acacia tree had changed everything. For the lions, for the reserve, for the people who witnessed it, and most of all for one veterinarian who learned that sometimes the most important medicine isn't in any medical kit. It's simply the willingness to answer when someone, anyone, asks for help.